Yahya Sinwar, the man who went from being a university student in Gaza to becoming the most feared leader of Hamas. A ruthless strategist, known for his brutality, yet with the ability to forge unexpected alliances. His life is filled with secrets, betrayals, and failed prison escapes. What lies behind the nickname, the Butcher of Khan Yunis? And more importantly, how did he manage to orchestrate and carry out the massacre of October 7th in Israel? Meet the man who, despite being sentenced to 5 life sentences by Israel, found his way to freedom to become the spearhead of the Sunni Islamist movement called Hamas. In the next few minutes, you will uncover the dark and complex story of the man who, in his attempt to destroy Israel, ended up buried under the ruins of his terrorist ideology. The conflict in Israel has deep roots. Since its establishment as a state in 1948, Israel has had to deal with several regional wars and numerous local uprisings stemming from the well-known Palestinian cause, which can be summarized as the claim to land that, according to Palestinians, rightfully belongs to them. They label the current state of Israel as illegitimate, occupying territories that the Palestinians claim as their own. For 76 years, this conflict between Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews has escalated, leaving countless victims on both sides. In 1987, the terrorist group Hamas first appeared, founded by Sheikh Ahmed Yassin during the First Intifada as an Islamist branch ideologically linked to the Muslim Brotherhood. Initially, Israel allowed its growth to weaken the PLO, which posed a significant threat to Israeli interests. However, Hamas quickly established itself as a militant movement and gradually gained independence, promoting martyrdom and armed resistance against Israeli occupation, which it began to frame as the real threat to Palestinian interests. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, amidst growing repression, the group developed a network of Islamic schools and medical centers, through which it achieved 2 fundamental objectives. 1, indoctrinating its future army from a very young age, and 2, providing Palestinians with an alternative social and healthcare system independent of Israel to gain popular support. This was made possible thanks to funding from businessmen and sheikhs from the Persian Gulf, who saw Hamas as an ally against secular leftist forces. Yassin was arrested in 1985 after weapons were found in his home, which made him a symbol of resistance that would inspire a young 23-year-old Gazan who had just completed his degree in Arabic studies and was beginning to emerge as an excellent political and religious activist. That young man was Yahya Sinwar. Sinwar was born on October 29, 1962, in the Khan Yunis refugee camp in the Gaza Strip, a region marked by conflict for decades. Although conflict was a constant in his life, his family originally came from Al-Maidal, a city now known as Ashkelon in Israel. This connection to lands his family had to abandon fueled his sense of identity and commitment to the Palestinian cause from a young age. After finishing high school in Khan Yunis, he continued his studies at the Islamic University of Gaza, where he earned a degree in Arab studies. The university, which at that time already had a fervently political and religious atmosphere, was where Sinwar began to take an active role in Islamist initiatives. During his years as a student, he was arrested for the first time in 1982 for his political activities. It was a brief detention but significant, marking the beginning of a long history of imprisonments. His first prison term was 4 months under administrative detention, and when he was released, he was free for barely a week before being arrested again, this time for 6 months. During this time in prison, he began to forge relationships with other Palestinian activists, and his political and religious vision intensified. It was at this point that he decided to dedicate his life to what he called the Palestinian cause, a euphemism for what would soon become an active and violent struggle against Israel. Between 1984 and 1985, Sinwar held a series of meetings with Hamas spiritual leader, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. These encounters were crucial in shaping his role within what would become the organization. With Yassin's blessing, Sinwar, along with his ally Voci Moshtaha, established a network to identify and eliminate Palestinians collaborating with Israel, known as the Majed. This internal surveillance mechanism was divided into cells within the Gaza Strip and was one of the first to develop what would later become Hamas's internal security infrastructure. In 1985, Sinwar was arrested again and sentenced to 8 months in prison, but these brief periods behind bars only strengthened his determination and position within the Palestinian Islamist movement. His moment of greatest significance came in December 1987, when he became one of the founders of Hamas, the Islamist organization that emerged with the outbreak of the First Intifada, the Palestinian uprising against the Israeli occupation. Hamas not only focused on armed resistance against Israel, but also promoted an Islamist ideology that quickly gained popularity in Gaza and the West Bank. On January 20th, 1988, at the age of 26, he was arrested again by Israeli security forces, and in 1989, he was sentenced to 5 life terms, totaling 426 years for the murder of 4 Palestinians, whom he suspected of collaborating with Israel. His sentence was not only for these murders, but was extended by another 25 years due to his involvement in planning the kidnapping of Israeli soldiers for negotiation purposes, all while he was in prison. Sinwar was no ordinary prisoner. During his time incarcerated, he stood out for his influence among other prisoners. He was both feared and respected, and he did not hesitate to use violence to maintain his authority. In fact, he earned the nickname, the Butcher of Khan Yunis, due to the brutality with which he dealt with dissenters and rivals within Hamas, even within the prison walls. Despite this, Sinwar also managed to build pragmatic relationships with Israeli security personnel, which allowed him to survive and maintain his influence. During his time in prison, Sinwar became fluent in Hebrew, which allowed him to give interviews to Israeli media and improved his ability to communicate with his captors. Additionally, in 2008, while still in prison, he underwent surgery to remove a brain tumor. Despite his medical condition, his power and authority within Hamas remained intact. Sinwar was transferred between various Israeli prisons over the years, including Shekma Prison, Hadrim Detention Center, Nefa Prison, and Ramla Prison. On at least 2 occasions, he attempted to escape, once by digging a hole in the wall of his cell in Shekma, and another time by cutting the bars of his window in Ramla. Both escape attempts failed, but they did not affect his status within Hamas. Finally, in 2011, after more than 2 decades in prison, Sinwar was released as part of the Shalit deal, in which 1,027 Palestinian prisoners were exchanged for the captured Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit. This release marked a turning point in Sinwar's life, as he returned to Gaza as a hero. His close relationship with his brother Mohammed Sinwar, who was also involved in Shalit's capture, secured him a prominent position in the organization. Now Sinwar was seen as more than just a hero. Gazans saw him as a leader rising from the ashes, their own version of the phoenix. Returning to Sinwar's psychological profile, which had always been a challenge for professionals in Israel, there was the claim that he had developed a messianic mindset unexpectedly, without seeking it. The people themselves elevated him to that level, which explains his decision in 2021 to launch an unprecedented operation against Israel, known in Israel as the Guardian of the Walls conflict. Following the ceasefire, Sinwar emerged as a strengthened figure within Hamas and among the Palestinian population in Gaza. Under his leadership, Hamas framed the conflict as a victory for having challenged Israel and launched thousands of rockets, despite the military power imbalance between the two sides. This war further deepened his messianic profile, positioning him as the only Hamas leader capable of achieving the dream of ending Israel and Jewish occupation. Sinwar was not only the most prominent leader of Hamas in Gaza, but also created its internal security apparatus, the Hamjad, aimed at identifying and killing Palestinians who collaborated with Israel. These collaborators were considered traitors, and Sinwar did not hesitate to enforce this vision with relentless violence. His release in the Shalit prisoner exchange was celebrated by Palestinians and their allies as a defiant act against Israel's citizens and military forces. He was, after all, the man who had escaped 5 life sentences, the man who had escaped from the lion's den. After his release, his political and military profile within Hamas continued to rise. In November 2012, during Operation Pillar of Defense, Sinwar met in Tehran with Qasem Soleimani, the commander of the Quds Force, further solidifying the ties between Hamas and Iran. In 2015, the U.S. government designated him as a specially designated global terrorist, along with other Hamas leaders such as Mohammed Daf and Ruhi Moshtah. However, this status only strengthened his position within Hamas. In February 2017, Yahya Sinwar was elected as the supreme leader of Hamas in the Gaza Strip, following internal elections, consolidating his power and his role in the organization, second only to the ousted Ismail Haniyeh. The brutal and horrendous attacks, meticulously planned by Hamas on the fateful day of October 7, 2023, were led by Sinwar. What transpired during those days can only be explained by understanding the psychopathic tendencies that enabled Sinwar to plan everything in such a way. The cold and precise planning, the strategic deception developed years before, and the many details of the massacre paint a portrait of a cold-hearted strategist, incapable of feeling empathy, guilt, or shame. To plan such a cruel and calculated action requires a complete detachment from any sense of humanity. This detachment cannot be carried out by a psychologically normal person. Psychopathy is a personality disorder that is not listed in the psychiatric manual, but is exacerbated by a condition known as antisocial personality disorder and has innate characteristics. These are completely cold people. Nothing penetrates them. That's why they don't feel guilt, anxiety, or obsessions. They are never disturbed by guilt or shame that could take away their peace. Without these feelings, the mind is free to plan in a lofty, cold, calculated, and especially emotionless way. Many mistakenly believe that Sinwar had the potential to propel Hamas to wipe Israel off the map, as many dream. Sinwar was not only pragmatic, but also realistic. He knew that the fight against Israel was entirely unbalanced. So his efforts and direction in Hamas didn't focus on trying to wipe Israel off the map. That task he left to his Iranian bosses. His goal was different. In one of several interviews, including one with the Israeli channel News 12, he said the following: "We know Israel has nuclear warheads, and we are aware it has the most powerful air force in the region. For us, it is clear that we do not have the capacity to defeat them, and that is not our goal either. We have one goal: to make life impossible for the Israelis, to make sure they suffer." With that slogan and clear objectives, the cold mind of this terrorist had gathered, during his years of captivity and through different conflicts, enough information to understand Israel's weak point. He knew that in a direct confrontation, he would always lose. So he focused on inflicting as much damage as possible on the collective psyche of the Israelis. He knew that Jewish mentality was marked by the horrific Holocaust that almost exterminated them during World War II. So he focused on causing terror through constant and relentless attacks on the civilian population. A kind of Holocaust in small doses, like drops falling on a stone. One drop does nothing, but if it falls repeatedly without stopping, it has the power to leave indelible marks. Sinwar's mind was the architect of the October 7, 2023 massacre, a plan that had not been devised in mere months. For years, Sinwar had organized a master plan of deception and infiltration into the very heart of Israel. He framed this event as Hamas's ultimate and most significant attack in history, intended to serve as a precursor for the hidden hand behind the scenes, Iran, to deliver the final blow through its network of proxies scattered across the region. The complex plan was to be initiated by Hamas and supported by Hezbollah in the northern border, which also had a plan to replicate the October 7th event, but on a larger scale, a plan that was ultimately thwarted but had a name of its own: the Galilee conquest. The war cocktail unleashed on Israel was supposed to include the Houthis, attacking Israel from the south, while pro-Palestinian terrorist factions within Israel's heart, in Judea and Samaria, would ignite chaos through multiple attacks. The final blow was left in the hands of Iran, the only country in the region strong enough to confront Israel's advanced military, which was expected to be weakened and scattered, trying to cover multiple fronts at once. The October 7th event was supposed to trigger a regional war that would finally achieve the dream of a free Palestine, from the river to the sea. It is important to highlight that behind all of this stood Iran, with the Ayatollahs in power, as confirmed by Sinwar himself at the time.
في عام 2014 ضربنا تل أبيب ب170 صاروخ، منها صواريخ فجر من دعم إيران، وغالبيتها تصنيع محلي بدعم وإسناد مالي وفني من إيران أيضا. أعيد وأكرر، لولا دعم إيران للمقاومة في فلسطين لما امتلكنا هذه القدرات ودعمتنا إيران بالسلاح والعتاد والخبرات.
While Sinwar's goal was to generate chaos in Israel, Iran had loudly proclaimed for decades its desire to exterminate the Jewish people. However, history is unfolding differently. It's true that Sinwar managed to outwit Israeli intelligence on October 7th, claiming a unique and invaluable prize with the over 200 hostages he managed to capture. Sinwar's plan indeed included the hostages. He had witnessed how the Israeli government had given in to societal pressure, releasing 1,027 terrorists in exchange for a single Israeli citizen and soldier. Sinwar saw Israel's value for life as one of its greatest weaknesses, a significant crack in the chain. If one soldier had been exchanged for 1,027 Palestinian detainees, what would happen if they could capture 25 or 30? In this terrible event, 1,189 people officially died, among them the elderly, men, women, and children, not counting animals. But the grand prize for Sinwar was the hostages, and they weren't just 25 or 30. Officially, there were 251 people, men, women, children, and the elderly. Certainly those days were dramatic and deeply confusing for Israel. Many explanations are still missing for what happened on that day, and many questions still remain on the table. However, a year later, history is writing very different lines from what Israel's enemies had envisioned in their plans. History has recorded that the Hamas terrorist group has not only been defeated, but its most prominent leader, its messianic figure, has been eliminated, and shame now stains the memory of his grandeur. Every single leader of Hamas was pursued, caught, and eliminated. Israel learned the lesson from the past. This time, it did not succumb to the pressure of having over 200 citizens held hostage by Hamas. It didn't yield to the pro-Palestinian propaganda that spread like wildfire worldwide. It didn't give in to the diplomatic and global authorities' demands to stop. Israel was determined. Sinwar had crossed the red line, and evidently his plan hadn't foreseen Israel's reaction if that line was crossed. One day, Sinwar survived an Israeli attack on his own house. Emerging unscathed from the rubble, he sat on a couch. The message he intended to send was clear. I am invincible. I am the liberator. On October 16, 2024, sitting on a couch amidst the rubble of the town he himself had dragged into misery, 62-year-old Sinwar saw the last minutes of his life pass before him, finally cornered. The pressure from Israeli army forces forced him to leave the underground hideout where he had been hidden for the past year. As he surfaced, he was able to see with his own eyes the devastation his fateful plan had caused, the misery into which his madness had buried his Palestinian cause. Finally, Israel had settled the score. Israel's #1 enemy in Gaza had been eliminated, and with him, a dream, a plan, an ideal. No more Hamas. Subscribe to this channel, hit the thumbs up, and leave your like. Of course, share this video, and together let's fight the other part of the war, the one on social media, where you and I are the protagonists.